Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power.
Let's now bring in Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu from Torrance. He's a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee and a veteran of the Air Force. Congressman, thank you for being with us. Let's start with your overall reaction to what you are seeing today in Ukraine.
Thank you, Alex, for your question. Let me first say my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine, and I am praying for them and their leadership. They're experiencing an unprovoked attack by Russia, and this is completely against international law, and is something that the U.S. and our allies are going to support Ukraine on. And we've imposed tough economic sanctions today, and we're going to continue imposing tough economic sanctions on Russia.
Are those tough economic sanctions enough? We heard President Biden call them severe sanctions today. By his own admission, he says he knows this isn't going to stop Vladimir Putin and the attacks and this all-out invasion. He knows that these won't be felt by Putin for a month out. Should we be doing more?
Well, let me tell you what we have done. The U.S. has targeted Russia's 10 largest financial institutions, accounting for about 80% of Russia's banking assets. The U.S. has also targeted a list of oligarchs who are supporting Putin, and we've cut off all technological imports to Russia. These are strong sanctions. And keep in mind, the Soviet Union collapsed not for a lack of military might, but because of their economy. Russia has a weak economy. Its GDP is less than half of California's. So this action by Putin is only going to further weaken his government and Russia's economy.
Why do you think Vladimir Putin is doing this?
We know from various articles published last year that the Russia economy had continued to go downhill. His approval rating started to wane. And I think he did this, number one, as a distraction. And number two, he's always wanted to bring Ukraine back into his view that somehow it belonged with Russia. Ukrainians don't believe that, and they have a democracy. And this really is an unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation and on democracy and on peace itself.
But does it end with Ukraine? I mean, the fear is that this could only be the start if he gets Ukraine, and he may do this with other countries nearby, including potentially even some NATO countries, and then all of a sudden the U.S. is involved in a war, potentially World War III.
You make a very good point. So Ukraine is not part of NATO. There's one reason that Putin has not attacked NATO countries, because under NATO, if a country is attacked, then all the other NATO countries will come in and defend that country. What we do know is that the Ukrainian forces are fighting the Russians in heavy conflict, and it appears that they're getting some victories, the Ukrainian forces. We'll see how long this conflict continues. But the people of Ukraine also have very strong resolve. And if there is a prolonged insurgency resisting Putin, I'm not sure that Russia comes out of this better, because it is one thing to use the military and take over a country. It's another thing to run that country. And we've seen time and time again that militaries are not equipped to do that.
Alex just brought up the prospect of World War III. That makes all of us shudder. We've been hearing that today. How likely do you think that that will actually come to fruition? I mean, there must be conversations happening in Washington about that reality.
President Biden was very clear that U.S. forces are not being sent to Europe to engage with the Russians in the Ukrainian conflict. We know that Russia not only has nuclear weapons, but in fact, they have more than half of the world's nuclear weapons. So President Biden is very clear that these U.S. forces are there not to engage in the Ukrainian conflict. At the same time, we are supporting the Ukrainian people. We're also going to provide them as much military assistance as we can. And we, again, pray for Ukrainian people to resist. And we're going to see what happens. Time will tell with these sanctions, but these are strong sanctions that the U.S. and our allies imposed today.
Some Republicans in the House, including Mike Garcia from Santa Clarita, is saying that some of this is because President Biden has been weak on the world stage. They point to his weakness pulling out of Afghanistan. They're suggesting that this wouldn't have happened if President Trump was still in power. We know President Trump has suggested that Russian President Vladimir Putin was a genius for some of the moves that he made recently on this. What is your take and your response to Republicans who say that President Biden has been too weak and President Trump was stronger?
It is outrageous for the former president to continue to lavish praise on Vladimir Putin, who is a murderer and an autocrat. And it is outrageous that the former president continues to fawn over Putin. At the same time, with President Biden, he has showed strength in withdrawing from Afghanistan. That was absolutely the right thing to do. We have been in Afghanistan for over 20 years. If we stayed another 20 years, nothing would have changed. If you can't win a war in 20 years, you're not going to win it staying 40 years. President Biden did absolutely the right thing, and it was a show of strength to withdraw from Afghanistan. And I know people now are not thinking we should be back in Afghanistan. Not even Republicans think that.
Of course, we're thinking of the Ukrainian people, the innocent people who are impacted. We have plenty of Ukrainian people within Southern California, of Russian descent as well. What do you want to say to them tonight as they're extremely frightened?
That there is bipartisan support to support Ukraine, that we have resolved that we're going to continue to impose strong and tough economic and diplomatic sanctions on Russia. And it's not just the U.S., it really is the entire world. You see Canada, you see Japan, you see the European Union all standing in solidarity to push back against Vladimir Putin. And with a combination of strong sanctions and diplomatic sanctions, as well as the will of the Ukrainian people to fight, we'll see if Putin has miscalculated. I think he may very well have miscalculated.
And just lastly, real quickly, I know you're really inspired by the people in Ukraine that are fighting back.
Not only are we seeing a tremendous resolve from the Ukrainian people as well as their military, we're also seeing tremendous resolve from a number of folks in Russia who have come out and protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg at great risk to their own lives. And we're seeing a lot of demonstrations. So this is happening on both sides, both in Ukraine as well as in Russia. And I think Putin may very well have not expected to see this amount of pushback on his unprovoked invasion of a democracy.
Congressman Ted Lieu out of Torrance, we thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Marla.